was then that I first saw the girl. She told us that her name was Jeanne. She told us she was but a peasant who did not know how to ride or fight. She told us that she intended to rescue France.
Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for Jeanne d'Arc. I'd like to give a shout out to CDN for picking this as a goal during one of my live streams, twitch.tv/Finotaisen. Original recipe Jeanne is a 5-star ruler, and any new player can pick her as their free 5-star after finishing Fuyuki. Even if my preference is for Zhuge Liang, Jeanne fills a role that isn't immediately obvious to FGO's neophytes, so it's worth understanding how she operates before you make that commitment. If you're wondering why this video is so damn long, that's because I cover Jeanne's history in the second half, so stick around if you want to know what's up with that. Back to FGO proper, one of Jeanne's biggest assets is actually her class. Rulers have defensive class advantage against 6 of the 7 regular enemy types, taking half damage from anything that's not a berserker. And of the extra classes, only Avengers are a direct threat. Between this and her massive health pool, one of the largest in the game, Jeanne has a tremendous natural bulk that lets her take an absolutely unreal amount of punishment. Now let's move on to her skill set. Jeanne leads off with Revelation. This grants stars per turn, capping out at 9. Being able to crit with Jeanne's arts cards makes her life infinitely easier. For this reason, Fragment of 2030 should be on your short list of craft essences to field with her. Double down on those stars. Jeanne has no second skill. Weird, I know, but I just see a gaping void between Revelation and Divine Judgment. Maybe it's a development issue. They couldn't put a placeholder ghost in the skill icon slot, so they settled for True Name Revelation instead. This is a paltry 30% NP damage reduction that only works on servants. You could stack it with other defense and damage reduction effects to weather enemy NPs, but the thing is that Jeanne has a far more effective method of doing that, and having a setup to spam her Noble Phantasm is better than trying to have it both ways. True Name Revelation did get an upgrade though, making its NP damage reduction work on non-servants. That's a start, but then it fumbles with a pair of defense reduction effects. Jeanne does no damage, and you don't run her in teams that are trying to push damage, so it's pretty wasteful. Even Jeanne solos would rather enhance her durability instead. As for Divine Judgment, it binds a servant for 1 turn. That's just a stun under a different name, which means it bypasses some narrow forms of stun resistance. Jeanne tends to have low value skills, but leveling this one up has tangible benefits through reducing its cooldown. Jeanne's whole game plan is juggling this and her Noble Phantasm to keep enemies at bay. It's also the reason why the Atlas uniform is her bread and butter. Its invulnerability and cooldown reduction give you yet another buffer against Murphy's Law. Jeanne's Noble Phantasm is Luminosité Éternelle. On release, this was a non-damaging arts card that granted a single turn of party-wide invulnerability, 3 turns of party defense tied to NP level, and a 2-turn party heal tied to overcharge. It also stunned her for 2 turns, which made it comically shit. Thankfully, it also got an upgrade that removed the self-stun and added a party debuff cleanse. That's right. By herself, Jeanne provides invuln, defense, healing, and a cleanse effect. Defensively, she's incredibly self-sufficient. Back in the day, you could use these properties to shore up a full defensive frontline, incorporating Tamamo for cooldown reduction and Waver for charge acceleration. In fact, this was one of the better ways of stalling out the King Proteus super boss in Seraph. That fight's mechanics wanted you to have a backline attacker, but for general usage, I prefer to run Jeanne solo. Jeanne's NP cycles can be quite tight, especially against short bar enemies like archers. To beat the clock, you really want to exploit the flat 20% charge from doing arts chains. The easiest way to guarantee that is to have Jeanne be the only one on the field. As a bonus, you'll get a little more charge from her extra card. To get every last draw possible, I'd strongly recommend equipping her with Prisma Cosmos for general usage. Its recurring charge will absolutely save your ass. Jeanne's heal is one of the weaker parts of her package, so I'd supplement it with command codes like Lucky Beast to get consistent value on your arts cards. Once Mighty Chains become a thing, you can also put 3-turn cooldown codes on her Quick and Buster cards. Mages of Flowers for 10% charge, and Maiden of Orleans for a 1k heal. While generally effective, Jeanne solos have a few major weaknesses. The first and more persistent issue is that Jeanne is an absolute potato. She does very little damage because her stat spread is so defensive, and also because she lacks offensive class advantage in most situations. Committing to a Jeanne run means you'll be spending a lot of time looking at a double-digit turn timer. Odds are you'll kill the boss eventually, but it's like watching paint dry. I guess this is one of the few ways that Restoration of the Radiant Holy Light actually comes in handy. If you dump it on your target during a Mighty Chain turn, you can push for a bit of damage, and your Jeanne solo might actually finish in her lifetime. The other issue is that Jeanne has no countermeasure against invuln, pierce, and buff removal mechanics. These become increasingly relevant in the endgame, and the sad reality is that a super boss in FGO isn't just a vanilla saber altar with 3 million health anymore. The endgame has crept past Jeanne's level, and you'll find her increasingly constrained. But that doesn't mean she's useless. Outdated, sure, but not useless. The people telling you Jeanne is useless are all ones with endgame accounts, or people just repeating what the first category told them. I bet you some idiot's already paused the video 3 seconds in to write, "Jeanne, you mean worse Castoria?" No, you insipid little parrot. How about you close Reddit for a minute and take a listen? Castoria might have superseded Jeanne in the meta, but she doesn't replace her single-handedly. Castoria is, by herself, an aggressive arts enabler with a get-out-of-jail-free card for the team. But she's not a one-stop solution for attritional setups. She's a caster with no heal, a hit-based Noble Phantasm, and very often no defensive class advantage. Because of this, she'll get chipped out over the course of a long fight and eventually KO'd. If you need to block 1 or maybe 2 Noble Phantasms, you can do this as an aggressive setup, but anything beyond that and you're playing with fire. That's why defensive Castoria setups turn into some variant of the Immortal team, with one of the Merlins for healing and either Morgan or Himiko for overcharge. And this complete Immortal team is indeed better than a solo Jeanne at staying alive and pushing damage. But it is a team. You're looking at 3 limited 5-star servants. Between the expense of rolling them and their restricted availability, there's no guarantee you'll be able to run this lineup anytime soon. By contrast, Jeanne is the Immortal Team 1.0 as a single servant, one that any player can just get from the free summon or random chance. She's in the general pool after all. Think of it like this. Jeanne doesn't have much use in the current endgame, but she's a stepping stone that lets you punch above your weight class with fairly low investment, at least until you get your modern Immortal teams in your 3-turn fast kill setups. While I wouldn't necessarily commit quartz specifically to getting her, she can be quite an asset if you pull her out of the blue, so don't sell this absolute sponge short. And now we're on to the story of Jeanne d'Arc. But first, a message from my beloved French viewers. Fuck you, why is your language so goddamn hard to pronounce? My tongue and the French language don't get along so well. I've looked up pronunciations where I could, but I'm probably gonna mangle something. Fair warning. Now then, on to Jeanne's history. Our tale begins not with Jeanne, but with a name you might remember. Philip the Fair. He's the king that destroyed the Knights Templar and burned Jacques de Molay at the stake. You may also remember that Philip the Fair was at war with pretty much everyone at some point during his reign, and that included the English. Well, that war was costing him an arm and a leg, so he opted for peace. To get the English off his ass, he agreed to marry his daughter to Edward II. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Maybe this would give the French crown some leverage down the road. Small problem though. The blushing bride, Isabella, was a ticking time bomb. Philip didn't live long enough to see the fireworks though, dying from Jacques de Molay's curse. Or a stroke. Jury's out on that one. Lucky for France, they had a young and healthy prince waiting in the wings, Philip the Fair's son, Louis X. He would promptly die from a tennis match that was so intense and thirst-provoking that he drank enough wine to give himself pneumonia. Well, that sucks. But mysterious Louis X had a pregnant wife, who gave birth to a son. But here's the thing. Having babies in medieval Europe was like rolling the gacha. We roll armless Shinjis, they roll dead babies. The French got a 3-star, so within 5 days, they needed to find another king, and Louis X was out of male children. He had a daughter who tried to stake her claim, but she was outmaneuvered by Philip the Tall, her uncle, who successfully argued for male succession only. He then shot himself to death. Dysentery doesn't fuck around. So then his brother got the crown and also died, with no male heirs. He had 2 daughters who couldn't rule because of that whole Salic law thing. Thanks, Tall Phil. So the job fell to Philip VI, a cousin of the dead king. And here's where that ticking time bomb goes off. Remember Isabella, Philip the Fair's daughter? Well, she'd been up to some serious shit over in England. After some court intrigue put her in a corner, she raised an army in France, invaded England, cucked Edward II, dethroned him, killed him, and installed their son as the King of England, Edward III, before ruling in his name as part of a regency. Wait a second. Son, you say? Technically speaking, Edward III, King of England, was the closest male relative of the recently deceased French king. But the French nobility didn't really want an Englishman on the throne of France, which is why they elevated that cousin instead. So England and France went to war. As it would turn out, a very long war. The 100 Years' War. It takes about 92 of those years for Jeanne to show up, so I'll spare you the details about the interim. There was a lot of back and forth fighting, bubonic plague was involved, and towards the end, France was on the back foot again. Their king, Charles VI, had gone insane, like attacking his own knights in the middle of a campaign insane. With crazy Charles in the royal nuthouse, his courtiers split into 2 factions that promptly went to war with each other. People got assassinated, and one of the faction leaders, John the Fearless, was getting a little too buddy-buddy with the English. Enter the heir apparent, Charles VII, or as I'll be calling him, Sneaky Bastard Charles. It was like, hey John, if you really are fearless, you'll come and meet me on this bridge. Bring your boys, I'll bring mine. So they meet in the middle and John the Fearless kneels since Charles is still a prince. You've got to show him some kind of respect. After this, he starts to get up, and while looking for leverage, he touches his weapon. Without missing a beat, someone shouts, "He's going for a sword!" And John the Fearless gets an axe to the face. But Sneaky Bastard Charles made some pretty serious miscalculations in doing this. Everyone knew he did it, and this drove the Burgundians into an open alliance with the British. It also got Charles written out of the royal will. His parents threw up the white flag and said, "All right, England, you win. Once Crazy Charles bites it, the throne is yours." Sneaky bastard Charles wasn't having any of this shit and established a rival court of his own to carry on the struggle. Now finally, we get to Jeanne d'Arc. She was a teenager living in a little village. The daughter of a farmer, she spent her days watching cows, weaving, and going to church. Normal peasant stuff. But her village was very close to enemy territory. Those Burgundians that sneaky bastard Charles pissed off, they controlled a solid chunk to the north. One day Jeanne's village was raided by the Burgundians, and after this point, Jeanne started hearing things. Not at the streets or at home, but in her head. These were the voices of saints and angels, and they told her to crown the rightful king. Sidebar, this part of Jeanne's life reads like the opening act of a Tales of game. It's kinda wild, like a Tales of West Francia. But Jeanne didn't know what a JRPG was. She was busy making her way over to a nearby garrison commander. She said, "Hey, I need to speak to the king. Take me to him." The guy's like, "What the hell are you doing here?" She then quoted a prophecy that had been going around, that France would be lost by a woman and then saved by a virgin. According to legend, this bit of soothsaying came from Merlin himself. The implication was that the woman who lost France was the living time bomb Isabella, while the virgin who would save it was her, Jeanne d'Arc. The commander wasn't impressed and told her to piss off, and she would, but not for long. She kept coming back, and during this time, she accumulated a band of followers who were impressed by this peasant girl's conviction. Eventually, the commander thought, "Am I the crazy one? Alright, fine. We'll see the damn king." To prepare for the journey, Jeanne cut her hair and dressed as a soldier. Women in military camps were associated with prostitution and subject to attentions of that nature. By wearing men's clothing, she could keep things on track with the whole saving France by God's grace thing. Jeanne and the boys made their way to the king's court at Chinon and went, "We seek an audience with Charles the Sneaky Bastard." Charles, thinking all this pretty strange but having time on his hands, decided to test Jeanne by being a sneaky bastard. He traded clothes with one of his courtiers and assumed his place, but when Jeanne came into the room, she made a beeline for the disguised Charles and privately traded words. We have no idea what they talked about, but by the end, Charles was sold. That said, he couldn't just let Jeanne run off and throw hands with the English as is, so the following days would be devoted to side quests. She received custom armor and a flag of her own design. The voices then told her that under the altar of a specific church devoted to St. Catherine, there was a sword. And sure enough, royal agents found the sword there. Less glamorous was the gynecology side quest, but the crown wasn't about to send Jeanne out as the virgin who'd save France without verifying that first part. During this time at Charles's court, Jeanne would make the company of a man named Gilles de Rais, who would become a loyal comrade in the fights to come. With a party formed and equipped, Jeanne was set out to deal with Charles's most pressing issue, the Siege of Orléans. The city held control over a particularly important river, so if the English took it, they'd open up their movement into French-controlled territory. At first, Jeanne was just there to raise morale. The sight of this girl, dressed in gleaming armor, riding a white horse, and waving a white standard certainly must have caught the soldiers' attention. But her fervor is what won them over. She'd ride over to where the fighting was heaviest, putting herself in imminent danger to rally the troops. When it was time to push the English out, she drove the soldiers to move forward and attack, even when their commanders wanted to take it slow and secure what they captured. This aggressive posture paid off, and the English position in Orléans collapsed without a chance for them to dig back in. She took an arrow in the process, but her rapid recovery only enhanced the sense of inevitability that surrounded her. Jeanne then surprised Charles by declaring that he must be crowned at Reims, which is apparently how you say it despite it being spelled R-E-I-M-S. You know, maybe the English should have done us a solid and won the 100 Years' War after all. There was a problem with Reims beyond the French language though. It was deep inside Anglo-Burgundian territory. But Jeanne was insistent and the Armagnac forces pushed through, cleaving a path through the armies and towns that resisted them. At Reims, King Charles the Sneaky Bastard had a formal coronation. The location had advantages. By accepting the crown in the hostile north, Charles's legitimacy grew, as did the idea that divine favor guided these events. This event was a massive boon to Charles, and it was at this point that Jeanne asked for a favor: tax-exempt status for her village. For Charles, this was a small price to pay for the crown, and he agreed. From that moment, Domremy would be free from taxes, a privilege it would keep until the French Revolution more than 300 years later. At this point, with Charles crowned, Jeanne had accomplished what the voices had told her to do, but the war wasn't over yet. So she pushed to attack Paris. As it would turn out, the voices didn't tell her to do that for a reason. With the army bogged down by abortive attempts at diplomacy and the entrenched English position, Jeanne's attempt to storm the walls would end in disaster, and Charles would call it off. Jeanne's aggressiveness had paid off up until this point, but this blunder would cost her one of La Pucelle's greatest advantages, that sense of inevitability. The spell was broken and she no longer had a perfect military record to push for these audacious campaigns. After this point, Jeanne's military fortunes would take a nosedive, and she'd be stuck commanding small forces in questionable sorties. It's in one of these adventures that Jeanne would be captured by the Burgundians. She was locked up in the castle and the English really wanted to get a hold of her. Jeanne had been a massive threat to their morale and they had plans for her. While the English and Burgundians figured out a price for the privilege of taking Jeanne hostage, she tried to escape by throwing herself out of a tall window. She survived, crazily enough, but was quickly apprehended. From that point on, her captors would keep her tethered to her bed, so she couldn't Assassin's Creed her way out a second time. Once the English took custody, they unveiled their surprise at last: a show trial. With Bishop Pierre Cochon residing over the case, Jeanne stood accused of heresy and witchcraft. Her deeds weren't inspired by God, but by the devil. A lot of the early trials centered on attacking the nature of the voices in her head. When this didn't produce the desired results, they switched tactics and got her on something far more concrete. Odds are if you do something remotely notable, you've violated some part of the Old Testament. And surely enough, there's a prohibition on cross-dressing. To seal the deal, Cochon took Jeanne outside to the stake and handed her a paper. To which Jeanne goes, "I can't read any of this." Cochon then explains that it was a confession of heresy, and if she didn't sign it, they'd burn her at the stake right away. So she signed it and was spared, but warned that if she wore men's clothing ever again, it'd be right back to barbecue. But the English and Cochon weren't exactly dealing in good faith here. Instead of being transferred to the custody of a woman's prison, she was kept as is. The guards started to get real handsy, and Jeanne realized that one way or the other, she was set up to fall. So she put on men's clothing again, which had been kept in her cell. And now the English had an excuse to burn her as a relapsed heretic. And so Jeanne d'Arc met her end, burned alive and scattered into the river Seine. She died, not with her family back in Domremy, with her king in Orléans, or her friends out in the battlefield, but alone, in the hands of her enemy. But her killers would not have long to enjoy their victory. The spirit of the French, withered from nearly 100 years of pestilence and war, was set alight by her deeds and would carry on, first separating the Burgundians from their English allies, and then driving the latter out of France, save for a port in the extreme north. But before any of that, remember Charles the Sneaky Bastard? He was surprisingly absent from the last part of our story, wasn't he? That's because he didn't lift a finger to help Jeanne after her capture. Whether for political intrigue or because she outlived her usefulness, he left Jeanne to fend for herself. Much like his murder of John the Fearless, letting the English have their way with Jeanne would prove to be a short-sighted decision. The trial wasn't just to fuck with Jeanne, it was to discredit Charles. Because if he was crowned by the actions of a heretic or witch, that would make his reign ungodly and illegitimate. He didn't get around to it until the 100 Years' War ended, but Charles finally established a retrial to rehabilitate Jeanne. It was a small gesture and a self-interested one on Charles's part, but at the very least, Jeanne's mother, who had been campaigning to clear her daughter's name for 20 long years, finally saw a measure of justice. Thanks for watching, and thanks once again to CDN for choosing this video as a stream goal. You can watch me live at twitch.tv/Finotaisen, and this month is going to be absolutely packed on that front. I've got some fun stuff planned, so stop on by for a good time. 3 p.m. Pacific time. I'll post the schedule on YouTube, Twitter, and Discord, so follow me there to see what I've got cooking. Till next time.